Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Peter Antevy. I'm an EMS medical director down here in South Florida, and I wanted to give a short presentation on the COVID vaccinations. I titled it, COVID-19 Vaccines. Should I take it, and will they be able to track my every move once I do? Obviously that's a little bit of a joke, but surprisingly, these are the questions I'm getting from many people, not just here locally, but also around the country. So I figured I'd take you in a little deeper into the science and then let you make your own decision. So here's how I look at it. What is the COVID-19 reality with respect to vaccinations? There's three categories of people, and you fit surely into one of these three categories. Number one, you're a hell yes, taking it no matter what, first in line, you're calling, you're wondering when that next vaccination is going to be available to you, okay? Or you're a hell no, okay? So if you're watching it and you're a hell no, you probably already turned it off, and there's probably little I can do to convince you. If you still watch and you change your mind, that'd be great. Let me know why that happened. But I do think that there are a lot of people out there who just don't want to even listen to this at this point in time. That will change once more data comes out and once people understand that this vaccine will save many lives. Then there are those who are not sure, so they're right in the middle. Okay, so first and foremost, let's do this with the hell no people, all joking aside. But what I would want to do now is look at the folks who are really not sure. Those folks, I think of them as people who are thinking about it. This is, of course, Rodin's The Thinker. You have a lot of questions, have not been answered perhaps, and you're wondering about the science, about the things you're hearing on the internet, and so forth. And I think this could be a good opportunity for you to learn exactly how this vaccine was built, and perhaps even a little history of where we've come throughout the last, over 100 years of science. So the agenda, I want to start off with a video that was really well made with Palm Beach County Fire Rescue Department that I'm very humbly associated with. Great department, great people. And you'll see in the video that I'll show shortly that we've had a lot of issues with people who have gotten COVID and who have suffered for months afterwards. These are young, healthy people. These are not what you would think of as elderly people who have had issues. Most of you have heard the term long haulers. These are them. We'll go into a little bit of vaccination history, which I think is always very important. And then we'll talk about how did we get here to the day where we can make vaccinations this quickly during a pandemic like we've experienced. And then a really big one is, how does the mRNA vaccine work? This is technology that's about 10 years old, and I think it's important to understand that it's a clean vaccine. And I think that once you see what's under the hood, I think you'll feel more comfortable with it. What's in the vaccine, a lot of people want to know, is there live tissue, placenta, is my wife going to get pregnant? All these questions, these are very fair. We'll talk about that. And then the efficacy studies. I think it's important to know exactly what's in the data that was submitted to the FDA, and we'll have a lot of in-depth review of that data. And then what are the side effects? Short-term, people want to know their long-term consequences, autoimmune issues, am I going to grow a third arm? I mean, a lot of questions people have. We'll try to answer those to the best of our ability. And then we'll try to bust any myths. And then I'll tease it right now that there will be a reference to Chick-fil-A nuggets, which my son happens to love very much. So we'll get to that later in the show. So let's go ahead first and watch this short video. This is Tara Cardoso of Palm Beach County Fire Rescue, and she's going to help narrate this great segment that talks about the long haulers we have at Palm Beach County Fire Rescue. And take a look at the video, and this is kind of how we'll kick things off.
Well, the pandemic is definitely wearing on all of us. And coronavirus fatigue, that's a real thing. As firefighters, you probably feel like you've heard everything there is to hear about coronavirus already. But there's actually one story you haven't heard yet. That is the recount from our own firefighters about how they went through the very worst of what COVID-19 has to offer. And that's a story worth listening to.
The stories are eerily similar.
Imagine that very deep cough, you really have to dig deep. That's what every cough was, and once you started, you couldn't stop it, or I couldn't stop it. So it was like a
The coughing fits were so bad I simply couldn't breathe around them.
The breathing part,
That's the main thing. Everybody has the other symptoms. Once you bring the respiratory aspect into it, it's a game changer. It's terrifying.
Yet also very different.
I didn't see why everyone was making such a big deal about this virus. And then the coughing started, and things went down very, very fast.
Everybody's surprised that I got it, and that I was too. I thought I'd be one of the people, if I did get it, I'd have for 2 days and be fine.
These symptoms kicked in after I was, diagnosed with rhabdo, and then the COVID reared its ugly head.
There is no rhyme or reason to why COVID-19 affects some people with mild to no symptoms and lands others in the hospital. Battalion Chief Walter Dillion, age 51, hospitalized for 10 days, recovery time 3 months.
And I felt like I was a fairly healthy person. I try to eat right, I exercise, I try to do the right thing. I don't smoke. I didn't see me as being a high risk. So I thought if, I would be able to weather it, and I simply couldn't do it.
Driver-operator Michael Redmond, age 28, hospitalized 6 days, recovery 6 weeks.
It completely took me out. I lost 17 pounds in a week and a half. I'm still trying to gain my weight back, my strength, my endurance. So.
Firefighter-paramedic Raymond Gosa, age 34, hospitalized 5 days, recovery 3 months.
I am not in control of this thing. I thought I could try to will myself out of this, and that wasn't the case. I thought I could, fight through this, but no, this is you are, at the mercy of whatever this thing is going on, that this novel virus that no one has ever seen and no one really knows what it is and how it works.
Raymond Gosa of Station 30 remembers vividly in what he calls high definition how close he came to being placed on a ventilator.
I see probably 5 or 6 people gowned up, ready to go, and I'm like, what's going on? It's like, well, we're taking you to ICU. And I'm like, really? It's like, is that bad? And she's like, yeah, you need someone to really pay close attention to you.
All of a sudden, instead of the person providing care, he was the patient.
That was when things started getting real, because now I'm on this side of patient care where it's someone else on that stretcher. It's someone else who's being on the monitor. Now it's me. They put me in the room and I just see all the equipment coming. They put a nasal cannula up my nose at like 40 liters a minute, 40, with a non-rebreather. So imagine sticking your head out of your car window going down 95. That's what this was like.
But he still got worse.
Respirations were probably sustained over 36 to 37. My heart rate was 40. And I'm still with it. We run fire calls and we run extrications. We have bunker gear, we got equipment, we got crew. I know what to do. We run medical calls where we have the best protocols, the best team, and equipment. I know what to do. But this, what do I do? With no gear, no protocols, no interventions, no bunker gear. What's protecting me from going down right now?
Doctors told Gosa he would have to lay prone or they would be forced to intubate him.
Tell them not to intubate me, because for me, that equaled demise. That was death. I mean, it's like, you kidding me? I'm 34 years old. Like, I'm not 84. I'm 34.
Gosa remembers every detail around him. One, in particular, had a major impact on him. He heard the doctor say, 1 hour.
I never thought that it was going to come to this. When someone says 1 hour, that's where you visually see the hourglass tip over and the sand starts dropping. And I started to ask myself, how did I get here?
All the while, his mind is racing.
But I come to work every day. I work hard. Why do I have an hour? I have 3 young kids at home. I want to walk my daughter down the aisle. I want to see her walk down and get her diploma. I want to hold my son's hand to his first day of kindergarten.
But he eventually did it with a prayer and a will to survive. he was able to lay prone.
So with everything in me, I knew if I started coughing, they were going to tube me, because that's what I was afraid of, because they were going to see this literal drowning and choking from the inside, and I didn't want them to see that. So with everything in me, I rolled over.
For firefighter Gosa, the hardest part was over. For each of these firefighters, there was still a long road to recovery after the hospital.
I'm still nervous. I'm working out and everything now, but I can still feel the stretching in my lung. Still have the presence of COVID in my lungs.
It took so long, to get back to normal. Making a sandwich left me breathless a month out of the hospital.
A resounding theme is gratitude for their brothers and sisters who helped them out, stood by their families, and the fire department behind them.
I can't thank the fire rescue family enough for what they did. I don't know if they'll ever know the magnitude of what they did behind the scenes, whether it was the meal train.
I've had tons of support from Chief Coyle, the fire chief. Everybody I've ever worked with has reached out to me, and it's awesome.
Coyle got on the phone, got him all kinds of heavies at the hospital contact, the direct nursing station, the woman in charge of the floor, found out who our doctor was and how to contact them. And he called every day.
So what's their message to our people? Be aware and take care of yourself and those around you.
This is not a state of paranoia. Okay, I'm not promoting being paranoid, but I am going to say, you do need to be prepared, and you should have a plan should you be the person that falls ill with this. If you have a hard fire, you got to watch yourself now, because you're in that gear and now your immune system is lower. If you have already been exposed and have been asymptomatic, that's something to consider.
It's not worth not wearing a mask. It's not worth not wearing your half mask, showering after these calls, deconning the trucks.
I am still very, very careful where I go and the PPE I wear. If anything else, just to set an example to those around you.
Through the experiences of Chief Dillion, driver-operator Redmond, and firefighter Goza, we can see and feel just how devastating and long-lasting COVID-19 can be, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The reality of COVID-19 is that while we know that people being infected with compromised immune systems are at greater risk of substantial health impacts, we just saw how Dillion, Redmond, and Gosa, three perfectly healthy and active firefighters, were critically impacted not just in the short term, but over an extended period of weeks and months. The emotional toll taken not just by the individuals infected, but by their families, friends, and co-workers is immeasurable. For me, I can specifically recall being told by one of our chiefs that he received a text from a firefighter in a hospital saying, "Please don't let them intubate me." This firefighter was in a hospital all alone, without family, without an advocate from the fire department. It was just him, short of breath, fatigued, frightened, and all alone, facing what he thought was his last days. I still get chills thinking about the helpless feeling that night and the days to follow, hoping and praying that he would pull through. Thankfully, he did. I'm asking that you please take heed of the precautions and guidance given by the CDC and fire rescue protocols regarding COVID-19, and let's work to stop the spread of this virus. Our community, family, and friends are counting on us.
Well, I hope that video was impactful for you. It surely is for me. I get many calls every week related to COVID. Happens every day. It happened today, where we have young, healthy people who are very ill in the hospital currently with COVID. So let's really circle back now and talk about the vaccination history. Where did we come from? I think this story you'll find quite fascinating. I know I did. So let's go back and talk about the history of vaccination. Where did it come from? And believe it or not, it all started with a disease called smallpox. Now, smallpox was a disease that caused the deaths of 300 to 500 million people, 300 to 500 million people, until it was finally eradicated in 1979. But it all started here with Edward Jenner, who's an English scientist who was born in the 1700s, and he figured out how to cure adults and children from this disease. And he did it not with something called vaccination, but inoculation. And I think this is really the fascinating part of the story that I like to tell. So let's start with this picture here, which is a picture of a cow and what we know as a milkmaid. Now, the word in Latin for cow is vacca, and it turns out that what they noticed in the 1700s is that disease of smallpox, which was killing 80% of children who were infected with it, and up to 60% of the adults who were infected with it. But the one group who did not get the disease at all were the milkmaids. And someone put two and two together, this is right before Edward Jenner came along, and said, hey, wait a minute, why aren't those milkmaids getting smallpox? Well, it turns out they were getting something else from the cow. As they were milking the cow, they got on their arms something that looks very similar, but it's much more mild, and it's called cowpox. So the Latin term for cowpox was vaccinia. So you're kind of putting two and two together here, but you're asking now, how does cowpox relate to smallpox? Well, it turns out Edward Jenner had an idea. He said, what if I take a needle and take the pus out of this cowpox, and then I inject it into another person, give them cowpox, and then see if we can give them the smallpox. And so Edward Jenner had the idea in May of 1796 to ask his gardener, who had a son of 8 years old named James Phipps. He said, hey, is it okay if I take some of the pus out of one of these milkmaids and give it to your son? And the gardener said yes. So Sarah Nelms was a milkmaid who had cowpox, the mild form. Then they expressed the pus into a needle and injected James Phipps, an 8-year-old boy. He then gets the cowpox, mild case of it. Then they go and they get the infection of someone who has smallpox, and they get that virus from that patient, and then they inject the little boy with smallpox sometime later, after his cowpox had already been resolved. And indeed, they waited to see what would happen. Would he die? Well, it turns out the little boy, James Phipps, never got smallpox. So this sequence of taking another virus, cowpox, injecting it into somebody, and then testing the theory by injecting the actual virulent disease, smallpox, into that same person sometime later, is now called vaccination. And so we've come a long way. This took thousands of years until we kind of came to this point, right? 1796 is when this all happened. And now here we are in 2020. But I think we should look at the history of smallpox to understand that it stuck around for quite a while, even after there was a determined cure. And I think we should learn from that history and talk about it. So I told you that in 1796, the first child gets inoculated against smallpox, and that in 1979 was the last case, the last recorded case. And in between, it's suspected up to 500 million people died. And you can see the numbers here on the graphic. Why is that? How could it be that for so many years, people just kept dying? And the answer is, similar to the story we're hearing today, is that a large portion of the population, specifically in America, said, I'm not taking that vaccine. You guys are going to try and, sterilize me and so forth. And for many, many decades, millions and millions of people continued to die until around the 1960s, when the World Health Organization and others made the big push to mandate smallpox vaccination, and finally they eradicated this disease. And that's why you don't get the vaccine, your children haven't gotten the vaccine, and you're hearing the stories now in the news with coronavirus that there's a large number of people who don't want to take the vaccine. Well, it turns out if we have that many people who stay away from the vaccine, we will travel in the same road, the same path as smallpox did. And unfortunately, COVID-19 will be around in our communities for years to come. So let's take a look at the medical advances we've had. First thing is important, measles, right? Our children get vaccinated against it. That's actually a live virus that's been attenuated. And basically kind of kind of tapped down a little bit so it's not the real virus. You can see the immune response for a live attenuated virus is strong. Booster are often not required, but it can become virulent again. As opposed to the next version, which is a killed virus, you know that as influenza or hepatitis A vaccines, the immune response you can see is poor. The booster is required, but it's safer because it's a killed virus. So again, this is kind of where we live now in this area of either live attenuated or killed. And then we made another leap, and so in 1995, we had a new generation of vaccines that were genetically modified. And this is how hepatitis B vaccination came along. And just a quick little image here showing that they took the actual gene from hepatitis B, they combined it with the genetic material of a bacteria, and then they actually grew that bacteria inside a yeast cell, and then, through the process of using things like fermentation tanks and so forth, they finally got the vaccine. But notice on the screen that there's genetic material of a virus inside of a bacteria. You're using yeast. And so this is not such a clean process. And again, newborns get the hepatitis vaccine really within weeks after birth. What was the next leap after that? This is where we are now, which is the mRNA vaccine. So hopefully I can give you the analogy here and explain why the mRNA vaccine is so much better. It's so much cleaner, and you'll see why in a minute. And it's really a brilliant mechanism. And for all the people who have, considered vaccination or have taken vaccinations in the past, you'll soon see why the mRNA vaccine is much safer because of how it's quote unquote built. And so what is mRNA? All mRNA is a piece of genetic code that allows the cell to form a protein. So what is a good analogy for me to explain mRNA, which is different than DNA, right? And so the best way I can explain this is using this analogy here with a computer and a printer. Now, imagine that this paper that came off of the printer is what we really need to give the body the immunity, right? So in the case of the flu vaccine, you're actually forming this killed virus in the lab, you're putting it into a vial, and then you're injecting it into the person. So the final product, which is again this piece of paper, is being formed outside and then being injected on the inside. But what if we could actually convince the body to make the actual material itself instead of us injecting the foreign material into the muscle? And so this is the perfect analogy here where I'm sitting at my computer, and when I press print, a message is going wirelessly through the air to that printer and telling the printer to print the message. So that is what mRNA is. All mRNA is, it's not a physical thing, if you will. It's just a genetic code. It tells the body what to make. In this particular case, I'm using the printer as an example. It's telling the printer what to print. And so what the scientists did is that they said, hey, you know what? Let's use the cell, and I outlined here in white the cell wall. And what makes proteins inside the cell? It's called a ribosome, like the printer. And then once the ribosome gets that mRNA message, it produces the antigen, or the printed paper. And so the scientists got smart and they said, hey, wait a minute. Let's not inject the antigen into the human being. Let's just send in the mRNA and then let it get picked up by the ribosome inside the cell and let the human cell itself in the muscle create that antigen. So if you think about the cleanliness of that, where if you can bring in this little mRNA particle, and as soon as it gets in and gets released, it creates that antigen, and then like a Snapchat message, it disappears. And so the mRNA is not made from living tissue. The mRNA is not fermented. It's not made with adenovirus or bacteria. It's none of those things. It's made from a genetic code, right? And so it's a much cleaner process. There's no live human tissue that's ever being used here. And so you're probably wondering, well, why is this technology just coming about in this last 10 years? It's because the mRNA is so fragile, they couldn't figure out how to inject it and for the mRNA to get into that cell without being zapped by the body. And so this is where the technology has come in. Now, for those of you who think that the vaccine is going to change your DNA, well, let me remind everyone that inside of the human cell, of all cells, there is a nucleus. That nucleus contains all of our DNA. So you can see here that the mRNA comes into the cytoplasm, not into the nucleus. It cannot get into the nucleus, therefore it cannot change your DNA. So all those theories of it's going to change your DNA are just patently false. So I think that this explanation really hit home for me, that we're sending in a code to actually let the cell build that antigen. And what is the antigen? It's a piece of the coronavirus, the spike protein of the coronavirus. So we're telling our own body, hey, build this spike protein, and then once the spike protein is built, then we'll form antibodies against it. Pretty brilliant move, actually. And so I mentioned earlier that the mRNA molecule is very fragile. So the main discovery is something called the lipid nanoparticle. And here's where my favorite Chick-fil-A chicken nugget comes in. Imagine that they took this very sensitive piece of genetic code and they wrapped it into something very fatty. That's the lipid nanoparticle. And then that's what's injected. And that fatty outer layer allows it to get into the cell safely. It's like a protective shield. The mRNA, which is inside, then gets released. It finds the cell's printer, or the ribosome. That genetic code tells the ribosome what to print. At the bottom here, you see this is the spike protein, or a piece of coronavirus, which then goes back up to the cell. Remember, everything's happening right in your muscle. It doesn't go anywhere else into the body. All of this action happens right here. Those proteins come up to the muscle cell, and then the body says, hey, you're not normal. Let me form antibodies against you. And that's the entire process. It's happening all in your deltoid, if that's where you get the shot. And it's a very clean and very efficient process. So much so that the data has proven that to be true, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So how did we do this so fast? How did we go from smallpox, thousands of years, then it took hundreds of years after that to kind of figure out the science, and then the measles vaccine took 10 years, and then we get to mRNA. It's very important to understand that the way we got to mRNA is through the Human Genome Project. What is the Human Genome Project? Well, it started in 1990, and it ended in 2003, and essentially this took $3 billion. You could see 200 labs, 18 other countries, and essentially they were able to figure out the genetic code of the human being, and there's 6 billion base pairs in our genome. I can come to you right now, take a swab in your cheek, take it to a lab, and they can print out for me on a Word document your genetic code on paper. It'd be a lot of paper, so we wouldn't do that. So the human has 6 billion base pairs. The fruit fly has 123 million. E. coli 5 million, and COVID only 30,000. So thanks to science starting in the 1990s and ending in 2003, we can now take really any organism and we can figure out the genetic code, the AGTC base pairs that make up that organism. And right when COVID came out in China, the scientists there got the genetic code, sent it over to the NIH, and literally within 2 days of the NIH getting that computer code, they were able to effectively print out this mRNA. They then put it into that Chick-fil-A chicken nugget, and they had a vaccine that was ready. And that is where the science has brought us today. And I think understanding the cleanliness of that science, meaning that there's no live tissue being used anymore, I think will make your decision easier once you understand why these vaccines will prove to be so much better than anything we've ever had in the past. So just a final review. There's the mRNA. There's your Chick-fil-A chicken nugget. It's protected. It gets to the cell of the muscle in your arm. It gets in there. It then releases that genetic code, okay? And then the genetic code finds that printer, and then that ribosome then prints out that little part, the spike protein of the COVID virus. It then brings it back up to the surface of the cell, and then your body forms antibodies to that protein. Very smart, just incredibly smart thing that they did. So we are in the future. It's not a virus. All it is a genetic code. And you may say, well, I've never heard of this before. Well, people who have had skin cancer, specifically melanoma, have heard of this before. They have used mRNA vaccines for cancer. Now you're thinking, well, isn't a vaccine a prevention? Well, when you're talking cancer, a vaccine is a treatment or a therapeutic. So they got the code from the melanoma. They took a piece of it. They formed an mRNA. They put it inside that chicken nugget. They inject it. Your body says, hey, that protein's not normal, and it attacks it and it attacks the melanoma. So when you hear about a cancer vaccine, it's different than the prevention that we use vaccines for now. In cancer treatment, vaccines are for treatment. It's a very fast development process. So nowadays, once they get that genetic code, they find the piece that they want to kind of create the mRNA for, and they just create it. And they can do that within a couple of days. So the United States, within 62 days of getting that code, already we're now getting the first human beings actually vaccinated in the first trials. So you saw it took about 2 months to get the trial all worked out and approved. The making of the vaccine was much shorter than that. And so we are in a place now. 2020 will be remembered as the year where the vaccination quality and the vaccination science just skyrocketed into the future. And that's the exciting part here. We will look back on 2020 and say, wow, that just was incredible stuff. Look at the effectiveness of these vaccines. I told you flu was a kill vaccine. You can see it's not that effective. Chickenpox, live, 92%. Skip down to measles and polio, very effective. Then look at the Moderna and Pfizer. These are the two mRNA vaccinations, and you can see that the efficacy is really very, very high. And it's because of the fact that this mRNA process that tells your body to produce these proteins is so effective. And that's proven out now in the data, which we'll go through here in a minute. Okay, so let's talk about the Pfizer data. This data was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which I'll show you here in a minute. This is a phase 3 trial where they had 43,448 participants, many countries, many clinical sites, and you can see half of them received the vaccine and the other half received the placebo, or just normal saline. And nobody knew which one they were getting. You could see that in the vaccine group, only 9 people got COVID. And by the way, out of those 9, only 1 had a severe case, and that patient did well. In the placebo group, you had 171 cases, 9 of which had severe cases. And we'll talk more about that data in a minute. But a lot of people ask, well, what happens if I only take 1 dose? What happens then if I take 2 doses? And you can see here that the data shows if you take just 1 dose, you still have coverage to the tune of 52%. If you take both doses, 7 days after that second dose, you have a 95% efficacy there for those vaccines, both Pfizer and for Moderna. So let's get into more detail on that. The safety data is important, right? If you're like me, initially I was skeptical, right? And I said, hey, I want to see what the safety data is like. They smartly included people of different races, with different health problems, different ages. And let's take a look. You could see here that there was obesity included, people with hypertension were included, and the most common side effects were pain at the injection site and fatigue and headache. And interestingly, those symptoms almost across the board went away after 48 hours. And why is that? Is because I told you, you're not injecting the actual protein, an actual virus. You're not injecting something that has maybe a bacterial or a viral carrier. You're injecting a genetic code that's mRNA, that doesn't affect your DNA, that's covered in a Chick-fil-A nugget, right? And then as that mRNA comes out, it rather quickly gets zapped. So within 48 hours, your body is back to normal again. And you'll see that. And when you ask people who have been vaccinated, they'll tell you that same exact thing. People really want to know, hey, show me exactly who was in those trials. And you can see very nice split of male and female. You can see 82.9% white, 9.2% black or African American, 4.2% Asian. And you can see down the list here that they really try to include as many different groups as they could. And then at the bottom, take a look that they included, the youngest was 16, and then they had split it up into the 55 and under, and then the 55 and older group. And I'll show you some data on that in a minute. So again, the side effects, it turns out, if you're in the 55 and older group, you have much less side effects. Pretty much across the board, people have pain at the injection site. People do complain of fatigue and some slight headache. And then only 16% of people under 55 had temperature of greater than 100 degrees, 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And then if you're older than 55, your chance of getting a fever was down to 11%. Now, here's a very important piece of this whole thing, is that when you look at the serious adverse events from both groups, the vaccine group and the placebo group, there was no difference. And I can tell you that here at our vaccination site, here in South Florida, the reactions we're having are mainly anxiety reactions. And just to prove that, we had one lady had a vasovagal event, and as soon as the ambulance came and lights and sirens and everything, 3 other people in that same room had anxiety type of symptoms. And so it's important to understand that if you're in the placebo group, or if you're someone out there getting a vaccine, you're nervous about it, we're seeing people who are having kind of anxiety-like reactions, although there are people who are getting the real allergic reaction. Far and few between, but they're happening. And so there's been some change in the guidance of, just be careful if you have severe allergies, if you're someone who carries an EpiPen. I think ultimately the recommendation will be to take that vaccination because obviously there's treatment if you have a reaction. So just to review here, the vaccine, this is specifically Pfizer, but Moderna is really the same. It's at 95% efficacy. The safety profile is very, very beneficial, and the symptoms resolve very quickly. This is an important graphic because it shows what exactly happens in the placebo group in blue. You could see that as the days went on, more and more people were getting COVID. But then something very magical happened here right at around day 12 or 13, and you can look at the upper box to see that. Really more like day 11, 12-ish, where suddenly, after dose number 1 of the vaccine, it was like a flat line. And very few people got the virus after that. And so this is a great depiction of the fact that if you get the vaccine after dose number 1, right at around day 13 or 14, you will have a significant amount of protection, which is great news. And then take a look now at this data, which is, again, from the same data set. In red are the people who got the vaccine, and you can see that 8 of the 9 people who got the virus had, just mild symptoms. Never went to the hospital, did fine. 1 person had severe COVID, had to go to the hospital, but that person did well. Compared to the placebo group, where you had many more people getting symptomatic COVID, and truly a much larger number compared to the 1, 9 times as many people ended up hospitalized. And so really take a look at these numbers. This is really staggering when you look at the efficacy of vaccination. And if you want to look at it a different way, all of the people in the vaccine group ended up doing well, right? We'll have to see how that bears out over time. But with the numbers of people, over 1.6 million people are dead in the world today, you could see that this vaccination, just like smallpox, was able to be eradicated. I believe that if we have broader coverage of COVID vaccination, then we'll do the same thing with COVID. What about Moderna? Moderna is the other mRNA vaccination. This was really the same type of outcomes. You could see they had fewer participants, but they also included people from different populations, different ethnicities. And you can see here that in the placebo group, 95 people compared to 5 in the vaccine arm got COVID. And so same type of efficacy. You could see again the side effects were almost exactly the same. Soreness, fatigue, fever, body aches. Again, this lasted for 48 hours. What about the logistics? I mean, this is just some fun information to know. Moderna could be put in your regular freezer, and it comes already reconstituted. It's already kind of liquefied. Whereas Pfizer, it comes as a pulverized powder that has to be kept in negative 70 degrees Celsius, so super ultra cold storage. And then at the site itself, you have to use normal saline to reconstitute it. So it's logistically tougher. And so you'll see the Pfizer vaccine kind of go more to the areas of where people can actually store it and logistically know how to use it better. Whereas the Moderna is really as easy as giving any kind of medication intramuscularly, much easier to use. Now, this is what they told us, right? That the rollout by the end of the year, which is only a couple days from now, that the United States was going to have 40 million doses. Well, it turns out we have far fewer than that, and not that many dosages have been given so far, maybe a couple million at most. So we have a lot of work to do, and I think it proves that just having a vaccine is one thing, but getting it out and getting it into arms, the act of vaccination, is I think a little harder than people expected. So here's some other questions. If I've had COVID already, do I still need the vaccine? And the answer is that the vaccine will give you better protection than the virus itself. So if you had a mild case, you definitely should get the vaccine. But even if you had a mild case, you more than likely have coverage for at least 90 days. And if you're in an area where there's not many vaccines available and you want to wait your turn in line to let someone else get it, maybe an elderly person, a healthcare provider, well, that's reasonable. But I think that ultimately you should get the vaccine if you've had COVID. It doesn't really matter, just get it. Obviously, if you're symptomatic currently with COVID, you shouldn't go get the vaccine. However, there's many stories of people who got the vaccine on the same day that they got sick, and those people did fine. Can you take this if you're pregnant? And the answer will turn out to be a resounding yes. And now the recommendations are coming out that if you're a healthcare provider and you're pregnant, then you should get the vaccination. But ultimately, this would be a conversation you should have with your OB or your gynecologist. And I think that we'll see that the recommendation as we get more data will be that pregnant women, just like the flu vaccine, should get the vaccination. And the cool thing is that the child, the fetus, will then get the protective antibodies through the placenta, so for at least 6 months of life. So I think you'll end up seeing more and more pregnant women getting this vaccine over time. Number 3, once I'm fully protected from the vaccine, will I still have to quarantine if I've had an exposure? And so the answer is, you saw the data that even the people who got the vaccine still ended up getting COVID. And so the answer for now is, yes. If you have a significant exposure, then you'll still be asked to quarantine. Of course, we're still going to ask people to wear masks for the same exact reason. Now, once we get, again, more data on whether or not people with the vaccination are actually contagious to others, that recommendation may change. But I fully agree with this recommendation currently to quarantine after significant exposure and, of course, to wear your mask. Now, let's talk about my favorite topic, which is the myths. I get these memes all day long from people. They're texting me, making funny jokes and so forth. So here's one of them, which is, here's the image of the first person who received the new vaccine. He says he feels great. Here's another one I got the other day, which was the alien asks, "Are you the only survivor on this planet?" And the guy says, "Yes, they forgot to vaccinate me." So there's lots of this, fun and games and jokes, and obviously I get a good laugh out of these too. But please understand the science, make a decision that's right for you and your family and the people that you're working with, the people in your community. Because if you don't have a large number of the population getting immunized, then you're going to end up where smallpox did. And I think that's going to be the big concern. Okay, more myths. COVID-19 vaccines will alter my DNA. Well, you saw the image of the cell, you saw the nucleus, the DNA is inside the nucleus, the mRNA doesn't get anywhere near there, and so it will not alter your DNA. We can put that one to rest. COVID-19 vaccines were developed using fetal tissue, and the answer there wasn't, right? The vaccines we've known and grown up with use other types of tissue, and I told you yeast and bacteria and other viruses. This COVID vaccine has nothing to do with it. It was made using a genetic code. It was wrapped in that lipid nanoparticle, the Chick-fil-A nugget, and it's very clean. It was made in a laboratory. Now there are chemicals in there, obviously, and that's what the people are getting reactions to, but there's no worry about any fetal tissue or that type of thing. Myth: more people will die as a result of a negative side effect to the COVID-19 vaccine than would die from the virus. 100,000% false. And I predict we will look back on this virus and this vaccination, and the mRNA vaccinations will prove to be the safest of the vaccines that we've ever had for the reasons I described earlier, and because of the fact that the data showed how mild those reactions were and how all of them kind of disappeared within 2 days. And then my favorite myth is COVID-19 vaccines were developed to control the population through microchip tracking or nanotransducers in the human brain. Newsflash, we already have people who are tracking our every move, and that's because Steve Jobs created this cell phone, okay? So thank you very much, but we already have people tracking us. And so a lot of people ask me, well, hey, do you believe in this thing? Are you going to take the vaccination? Which one are you going to take? And so I was offered the Pfizer vaccine here on December 15th. I signed myself up. Thankfully, Memorial Healthcare System offered that to the frontline providers. And I got my vaccination. This is Steve here. This is me at the Memorial Healthcare System at the pharmacy here in Miramar. And I got the vaccination. I've been doing great since then. In the 2 days following that vaccination, I had a little bit of headache, took Tylenol once a day, and I had some fatigue, but I worked 2 full days, didn't take any extra rest. And then I thought it was really fascinating that they actually told me to sign up for this little app on my phone called vSafe, and every day, it takes about 30 seconds, and I feed back to the CDC how my symptoms are doing. So they have real-time feedback on all the millions of doses that are being given here in the United States. So before you go, or even while you're there, you'll download this little application. The next part is that I was wondering, hey, when am I going to get coverage? When are my antibodies finally going to show in my bloodstream? And so I've been checking my antibody levels for the past couple of days, and here we are now on day 14 since this picture here. And you can see here in the image that this is from this morning, and you can see here that I now have the IgG antibodies showing. So exactly what the New England Journal paper showed, that right around day 12, 13, or 14 there, that you automatically had that change in the number of people who got infected. It's nice to know that after 1 dose and after 2 weeks, you could take a big sigh of relief and you can say, hey, I'm protected, and I can protect the people around me. And I happen to have 2 children who are very high risk. One's a diabetic and one has a severe lung disease. And so I'm breathing a sigh of relief that I can protect at least my children and others that I'm around. And so that brings me to the end of the presentation. I hope you found some value in that. If you're a hell yes person, great. If you're a hell no person and you're still watching, hey, maybe we converted you to a not sure, and maybe you can start thinking about this a little bit further. Either way, one day let's go have some chicken nuggets together at Chick-fil-A. This has been Dr. Peter Antevy. Great talking to you, and find me on Twitter if you have any questions. Thank you.